Hello everyone, today we spend some thoughts on the Roman Empire. There is a couple of reasons why I'm doing this. The first one is that from some time I've been seriously thinking about starting a news series. Now Schwerpunkt is getting overcrowded by different topics on Roman history, in fact, which I've already started doing from what concerns the military side of Schwerpunkt. I've started made several videos at this point in my Roman warfare playlist, in fact, about the Roman military, which is frankly the thing that I know best of Roman history compared to the others. I mean, it's just myself. But to tell you the truth, I'm a great lover of Roman history, and I haven't been talking about it on Schwerpunkt, if not for what concerns medieval times, because in this kind of manualistic videos I make on the Middle Ages, naturally there is Byzantine history and it's perfectly fine to discuss it. I've been discussing partly also Byzantine military history as well, so the point here is that we lack a series of videos on, I would say, manualistic Roman history at this point, from the origins of Rome to fundamentally where I started eventually to say Byzantine times. That I know it's a wild approximation, doesn't mean anything, but we all understand the medieval times of the Roman Empire. So this video, in fact, is and I'm still undecided, because I realized that Schwerpunkt is mainly about it's about a lot of things, really. But it's up to this point, at least, it's been mostly about the Middle Ages, right? And even though I started to make military history videos from roughly the Bronze Age, mostly from classical times, to the modern age, up to the 17th century now, I would like, and I realize it's a lot of kind of things put together, and the reason why I haven't discuss Roman history at this point is fundamentally that I think the Schwerpunkt would become too chaotic. And at this point, though, I don't think it's so true, because I realized that at least several of you expressed me their approval fundamentally on the kind of range of topics I cover up to this point. I realized that many of you are interested into Roman history. There are certain other resistance that I have for discussing Roman history, because it seems out there that everybody has an opinion on it. Whatever you say about it, there is always someone who complains, who has to express itself. Why? I don't know. It's the same reason why so many people are passionate about Roman history and they don't give a freaking damn about Middle Ages. Even some of you I've seen have come across Schwerpunkt just because they were interested in ancient warfare material, and they essentially were not interested into the Middle Ages. It's fine. I mean, everybody has its own interests. I happen to be a medievalist, and therefore I thought that I could make more videos on Schwerpunkt, and therefore grow faster by discussing in general terms medieval times, because it's in this way it was easier for me. That's the real reason. As you know, Schwerpunkt has been born as a project on military history as a whole, reason for which I introduced it von Clausewitz recently and the reading of the Kriege. But I think it's also different to discuss, in fact, Roman history and medieval history. Medieval history is objectively more difficult than Roman history to understand, chiefly because we know enormously more about the Middle Ages than we know about the ancient world. Secondly, because Rome has been something unitary. So even though it was something extremely complex within itself. I mean, think of just about the Roman Empire, but just Roman society in general, all centuries, is pretty complicated to study. Fundamentally, you follow the history of a single institution, reason for which, in fact, it wouldn't make sense to even distinguish Roman and Byzantine history as we tend to do. For instance, I use the Byzantine term just to make you understand more simply. Instead of saying medieval Rome, I'd say, which is also kind of a silly approximation, as we've discussed the concept of Middle Ages as non-existent fundamentally in actual fact. But there is this continuity that you can follow, and that makes it theoretically easier. So also, while the Middle Ages are relatively well documented for so many areas of Europe, the Roman Empire, from the ancient world, really, we have just a substantial knowledge only about certain empires. We know a lot about the Greeks, we know not about the Romans, and there are just a couple, like, especially for classical times, like 20 peoples about which we know something just because the Greeks or the Romans wrote about them, and we wander into darkness otherwise. So these are problems naturally that are proper also the late Roman times and the migration era, the early medieval times, whatever but it's still substantially different. So I have some perplexities now also, organizing a history of Rome, because, for instance, probably you've noticed that with the Middle Ages I kind of wander around. While I change wildly times and spaces at every video. So, and I think the Middle Ages are very good to be told in that way because of their very complex nature, their localistic perspective, etc. So I don't know whether that would work effectively also for a Roman history. Because in order to understand certain transformations, etc., you should go in kind of in chronological order, which is something I don't want to do, because I'm used to look at different things in perspective. So it's a kind of a challenge, but I think I can make it. So today, however, and I'm telling you this because today I randomly decided to discuss about something about the early imperial times of Rome, as a propedetic video for introducing late Roman times that we discussed, satisfactorily up to this point, given the randomness of our topics, and therefore we'll stick to that. And I threw in also this reflection, this question I posed to you: where would you like me to talk about general Roman history? So aside from just the military side that I obviously will keep discussing, because it's one of my favorite topics, also about Roman history as such. Roman history is mostly about war, so it's kind of similar in a certain fashion. But it's and this video is also a bit of a presentation of more or less what I can tell you about it. As I was saying before, I'm a medievalist, therefore also in Roman history, albeit I've spent now several years reading, knowing, and have also other reasons for knowing Roman history at a decent level. I'm no expert specifically, so I would also proceed in a different fashion. Naturally, I'm also not expert of most of medieval things I discuss, but I got perhaps more used to say. Sometimes perhaps I even grow repetitive about certain concepts, and so I don't know how you come across maybe this, whether you release in all of them or you hear them from first time. In the second case, probably it works better for you because you don't hear me rambling that often. You probably incidentally stumble into this video, and you just listen to it. I see it from the stats, so that works fine. But so I don't really know. Today, however, we introduce this part of Roman history that, as I was saying before, it's also the one I know kind of less, because I'm not a great I can't say. First of all, I'm not a fanboy of anything in history. I love Roman history, as I love some other things I've studied also more thoroughly in my at university, but I never treat history like, oh, these are the cool guys I like and therefore I should incense them or something. No, I don't really care. I don't really give a damn. And frankly, since by nature I think I tend to go in different directions from what the average likes, I'm not a huge fan in general about early imperial times. I love the early Roman Empire, and it's one of kind of I can get hyped with that too. But my favorite period is definitely the well, I would say from the battle of the Aldia River to roughly the Principatus to Augustean times, and so I love this almost 4 centuries of Republican history more and best, especially the 3rd century, and also the in the 3rd century BC and in the 2nd century BC, which is also pretty much overlooked. And then, of course, I love late Roman imperial history, because when you study Middle Ages, you're kind of broad, at least where I studied this, to know something about late Roman times. Although, also in there, I'm not no expert, never went thoroughly in detail. So today we discuss something that is said more iconic, or early Roman imperial times. So here we also, I will naturally brutally approximate. I don't know how long I'm gonna talk, because these are quite big topics and they're difficultly concise. I mean, you can definitely make a difficultly make a synthesis of them. But I'll try, just, if you've never ever got interested into Roman history, this might be useful for earlier imperial times, and looking at some perspectives that naturally we will necessarily discuss at one point on Schwerpunkt individually and in thorough and more decent detail, I would say. So, starting with talking about the history of the Principate, fundamentally. So we will not even much, because today I would like to stop to the 1st and 2nd century AD. We're not even gonna address, if not in perspective, the 3rd century crisis. But let's fundamentally look at what the Roman Empire was at the end of the 1st century BC onwards, and how it had started. So, as you know, Octavianus Augustus had founded this balance that he basically conceived at the end of the civil wars. Also in here, I'm tempted to open huge parentheses, but I can't do it, so just bear in mind there is a matter of time. I have to be simplistic necessarily at this point. So it's the balance that Augustus set with his institutional reforms, military reforms, the asset of the provinces and so on. It's a system that remained standing fundamentally until Diocletian and Constantine, and even though which is amazing if you think about it, and even if it remained stable, only for 2 centuries fundamentally, because in the 3rd century things start to get relatively messed up in terms of the Augustean model of the empire. The results, the achievements of this man have been amazing. Personally, I consider Augustus the greatest politician of all history, because you don't find usually a system that is able to last so long by the fundamentals given by a unique person. Augustus really changed forever the history of Rome, probably for the better. There were just a very few faults in this system. There were relatively serious, but you also have to be contextualized, and if you look at it in perspective on the long run, it was a hell of a thing that Octavian created. So there is this also enormous propagandistic work of Augustus that lives on ideally for all the Roman Empire. Naturally, it's Augustus also as a collecting Caesar's legacy, but fundamentally expanding it and kind of being very, very different also in part, created was fundamentally opposed by many people. The Romans were they had this kind of sort of democratic system, which was nothing like that, because Rome has been at all times an oligarchy, fundamentally, that with Augustean times transformed itself progressively into a monarchy. So the democratic asset in here was something right of the res publica was fundamentally just a from the senator, from the aristocratic point of view. I mean, the senators wanted their space, wanted to manage their properties relatively freely. Augustus gave them kind of balanced. Augustus was a great political equilibrist in some ways. It basically didn't solve even certain problems that other successors of his dealt with, also with dramatic outcome, because either were killed or and also in here historiography has depicted certain emperors in a negative, under a negative light, simply because, you know, the historiographers of those times were aligned with their political opponents, chiefly the senators, who wanted kind of a private aristocratic management of the empire, all for them, while certain emperors that passed to history because of historiography as kind of monsters were depicted like this, essentially because they had tried to go against that, to basically reduce the senatorial luxus and to create a more dynamic system favoring the middle classes, and this is often misunderstood in Roman history. Even figures like Caligula or Nero that are represented as fundamentally as even mentally disturbed individuals, were so greedy and evil and depraved in many ways, actually were, as much as we know, because we know a very few, especially about the Julio Claudians, but in general, probably there is a whole different reality that obviously we can't see beyond the historiography, that however leads us strongly to suggest that very likely this reality was very different, for which it was just the senators who were trying at that point to frame also the imperial power into their hands, and the emperors were instead pushing for a very different model, was in some part anti-aristocratic, or at least was favoring certain classes instead, that the senators that were pushing for a model of economical stagnation that in part also occurred later, probably not because of the same senatorial luxus, of this political orientation, but simply because the system was rigged, or had, however, some limits in its very essentials, and in a certain sense Rome had to decline at a certain point, and we'll see it now. And Augustus declared fundamentally in 7044 ab urbe condita, so that would be 9th century and the 9 BC fundamentally, the famed Pax Romana. So it was officially proclaimed on January the 30th of 744 from the foundation of Rome, through the consecration of the Ara Pacis Augustae, or maybe in Restituta Ara Pacis Augustae, in the Campus Martius, and this was essentially a very powerful political slogan to put officially, ideally, an end to this terrible moment of civil strife that had engulfed the whole Roman world for decades fundamentally, and was preceded also by a great political instability and institutional uncertainty, to which Augustus basically put an end, creating a system that, albeit relatively fluid, because it was fundamentally the idea that the princeps is simply a first among equals, but de facto was also something very different in nature from everything, even from Caesarian models. Many people say that fundamentally Caesar was wanted to be kind of a monarch at the end of the story, but that's a bit of also anti-Caesar ideology. What Augustus did was truly revolutionary in at least in terms of Roman institutional praxis. Then I don't want to enter more far than that. And we will have time to observe this, but there is a very important character also of the Augustean legitimization of power that stemmed from essentially a divine bond. This is also quite overlooked. Many people look at the Roman Empire as a sort of modern secular state. It was nothing like that. The Roman Empire was heavily, at all times, influenced by religion. Augustus was basically picturing himself as carrying out a divine mission that was to sanction the order on earth let's say what it says is something like auspicis meis. So fundamentally, at that point, Augustus was mediating with the gods according to his political theory, and therefore he had to be obeyed in virtue of the divine messages. The divine omen, auspice, as you want to call it. This is very important, and it is also strictly related with the nature of the empire. We should say what Augustus means, comes from the Greek sebastos. We will have. That's why I want to start a series of video about Rome, because these are very complex thoughts we have to analyze in detail. But there was a divine sanction to this, and all Augustean politics and propaganda was based on this concept of pacification of the at a ecumenic level. We have always to remember that the Romans, after the Jews, were basically the people that believed the most in its divine election. Fundamentally, the Romans were truly convinced since a very early age that they were the ones who had to conquer the world. I made a video that I also put in evidence in my when you click on my channel. That is the one on the Eagle of Rome. The title is The Roman Eagle, an omen that they shall conquer all against whom they march. In there I explain something under this point of view. It's crucial to understand all Roman history, mentality, and politics. The Romans truly believed they were ruling over the world. And frankly, from their perspective, they were right. This is also something that is often overlooked, that we tend to think about the borders of Rome, the frontiers of Rome, but if you had seen it from that point of perspective, there was no real border, there was no real frontier. Rome, de facto, given the geographical knowledge of the time, was ruling all over the world. And in fact, Rome ruled from Italy at this point. To say that Italy remains throughout all the 1st and the 2nd century AD, and even part of the 3rd, the true center of the empire. That's where most of the Roman citizens came from, where at the beginning, at least of this moment, most of the Roman legionnaires also were. There is this strong Italic Latin character of the Roman Empire maintained during the early times, and from Rome, therefore, the empire stretched around all this area of the Mediterranean. Naturally, that at that time was really in the west the real center of the world. Continental Europe was relatively backwards, but the Romans, as we know, contributed to fundamentally build infrastructures, to expand it, to Romanize it, and most of what we discuss, in fact, on Schwerpunkt relatively to the Middle Ages cannot be understood at all without Roman history. In fact, even in those areas that were not conquered by the Romans back in the day, were, however, in medieval times still kind of Romanized. You can't say it in that way through what essentially the models that the Romans had settled. In many ways, and always stressing that Rome is a universal concept. It's really the universal empire. So in terms of political and military authority, of law, quite importantly, and therefore of written culture, and the same Christian church that eventually takes over the empire, religiously speaking, is a Roman model, if you want, because even if it's born somewhere else in the Near East, and it's still penetrates the empire in a way that it's resized, remodeled, and from there expanded even beyond, in fact, the Roman frontiers through Roman models, especially in the West. Naturally, in the Middle Ages, you have this splitting of, in fact, Western Christianity and Eastern Christianity, even though there were even other Christianities around the world, even into China, into Ethiopia. We know this, but it all started fundamentally also from this great basin, Mediterranean basin, that under this point of view you can interpret culture also in many ways, because you can argue that the Roman Empire was a sort of Hellenistic empire. Especially from the 2nd century AD and onwards, there was this Hellenic element that also began to expand, to take over. The Roman elites were Hellenic in education, since chiefly, at least the 1st century BC. So there was this multicultural nature of the empire. That was a bit how the Romans also had managed to expand, because unlike the Greeks, who in fact remained where they were at the end of the day and were conquered by the Romans, they were open to other peoples. The Romans extended their empire through the extension of their citizenship, and therefore allowing political participation to peoples, or better, their aristocracies, as long as they expanded. If Rome had not done that, it would have remained, in fact, a very different entity that might have not even come out of central Italy, for instance, just like other Greek polis. In fact, even the great Hellenistic empires that you find in the East, that also the Romans come to conquer, were quite different also from the Hellenic model of the polis. They were fundamental, more kind of tribal empires like Macedonia, from which all the others. So there was a different concept of command. That also the Romans. The Romans. There is also so much to say about this, that in all this, in spite of the Romans took so much from other peoples, and which it's become kind of a cliche in many ways, because the Romans had certain unique characteristics since the very beginning, and the worst of it, let's say, at least for the peoples that came in contact with them, is that the Romans knew it, were perfectly aware of this. So the Romans were absolutely not, as you hear very often around, a mere collectors of copiers or stealers of other people's civilization. Rome had, since the very beginning, certain political and social, and more broadly cultural characteristics that made it feasible for them to create the empire that they did. And if they hadn't had, they could have simply copied or absorbed so many other things, like other peoples did all the time, by the way, but not achieved what they did achieve. So, going, however, back to the geographical dimension of the empire, you see that the empire stretched until, from Rome up to the Caucasus, the Euphrates, Ethiopia, the Atlas Mountains, to Britain, to the Rhine, the Danube. So a huge territory. Just think about even the communications of those times, what it meant to rule over this so many different environments, different populations, etc. So what the Romans made it was not just through violence and through arms. That is definitely how the Romans expanded their empire, not very differently actually from any other people that existed at the time. Simply the Romans did it better than the others. But also thanks to this kind of truly civil process that starts very early into Roman history. And also I should make a video one time about defining clearly what is that we define by, for instance, by Roman, Latin, Italic. These are kind of very different things that have to be understood and analyzed individually, because I realize there's a bit of confusion out there, at least for who is not well acquainted at least even basically acquainted to Roman history, which happens, however, because also this idea of coming back in time and looking at something modern, it's always, most of the times, it's kind of wrong all the time. But what I wanted to stress is that at this point the Romans truly believed, I mean, conquering all these lands, that uh, it's important. Today we know how the world is made. At the time they had a completely different view of the ideal. We are all grown in our school, in our rooms in schools, you know, with maps, with satellitary maps, with and geography that you can take. At the time, geography was really very, very different. The Romans were there were completely different ways of looking at space, even at time. But the geographical knowledge was very, very different from the one we think of it today, and it's probably one of the most difficult things to understand from the ancient times. However, stretching over all of these over the world fundamentally, it was believed that Rome was really the center and the capital of a universal empire that was given the divine right to govern all over the other peoples. The Romans truly believed in their divine missions of ruling over the other peoples. This was how the Pax Romana eventually was formulated. I mean, the concept that the Romans had to preserve the peace and prosperity of the populations that it ruled in. Naturally, it's kind of a pink picture of an otherwise very grim reality, but we should say that the reality at that time was grim, independently from Rome, and Rome, objectively, in spite of the slaughtering and enslavement of millions, etc., managed to build something over the centuries that was meant to last, in fact, till this very day. And that was incredibly, it was remarkable, it was amazing indeed, in many ways, because many people say, what did Rome, why is that the Roman Empire fell eventually? Now we will also discuss it a little bit. But the question really is, for those times, how the hell did they made it to make it last so long? That's the real question. Because even if you consider how these populations were practically subdued, you realize that there was much more than violence or deterrence and something like that. There was also participation to the empire. That is something that, in fact, when it came to fade, because the social dynamics were kind of, exhausting the potential of the system at the point, it's when the empire gets into crisis. And now also we know that the empire kind of lasted for more, but if you take the 3rd century, for instance, that was a moment in which the empire could realistically fall. Instead, it didn't. It lived on for other 12 centuries fundamentally. So that's very important to understand, that what we see is not to be given for granted. Empires are not kind of monolithic blocks that are set at one point and then you can simply let them being ruled by themselves. And, that they need a system that is constantly functional, and given that the control over these populations was also relatively unstable for the coercive means of the time. I mean, revolts in certain provinces didn't happen for centuries fundamentally, but because there was a system that was actively preventing it, and that was meant to function in that sense. Think about the Roman military. The Roman military was the largest and most efficient component of the Roman state. Definitely, basically, all the expenses of the empire were about the military. This is really not a surprise, meaning that at all times, at least I believe until the Industrial Revolutions, etc., the greatest expenses were about war, about maintaining an army. But in order to maintain an army like the Roman one at the time, which was not even enormously huge, it wasn't. There were some couple of hundreds of thousands, given especially the citizen army, but they ruled over an immense territory. But even that, it was particularly well organized, and that organization needed a statal machine that functioned, and it was very easy to make it fall. Well, the Romans made it to make this working for centuries and centuries, and to fundamentally cope with all the major threats that arrived against it. And even the same collapse of the western part occurred for dynamics that are kind of sometimes more reversible than we can imagine. For instance, I strongly believe that the western half of the Roman Empire could survive if it hadn't been for a few single episodes that could have taken a radically different path. Could have had a radically different outcome, and therefore, conversely, also the longevity of the empire has to be taken as something amazing for those times standards, as an achievement. So the Romans rightfully believed to rule over the world. The only major political entity that interfered in this plan, let's say, was the Parthian kingdom, the Arsacid kingdom, later the Sassanid Empire, that felt as the heir, fundamentally, of the ancient Achaemenid Empire, and which was out there, was on the eastern frontier, as we know, and in a certain sense it constituted a limit to the authority and the power of the Caesars. But at the same time, even from a Roman perspective, it was considered kind of a barbaric kingdom. So it was kind of foreign, and civilly speaking, it was deemed as inferior. And objectively, until the Sassanid times, the Parthians were not really a threat to the empire. Even the Parthians were kind of very, I have kind of a positive picture of what the Parthians were, because usually the Parthians are mocked a bit because they were saying that it's usually said they weren't so effective, even military speaking. They didn't have such a great. Of course, many people remember Carrhae, as it will, as in 53 BC, as the great defeat of Rome. But really, Carrhae was not this huge match compared to other battles that the Romans suffered, and it basically Carrhae didn't stop much. The Romans made it to conquer the Near East, to extend their authority often also over Mesopotamia. The Romans did march on the Parthian capital at one point. The Parthians couldn't even hope to do anything like that. Definitely the Parthians had some limits. Now we can't talk in detail about them, but in fact, this is the point. We often forget that first of all, the Parthians were something very different for the Sassanids, that instead had a very high offensive capability, and they were a very tough foe to match for the Romans. Well, the Parthians were relatively marginal, and the main problem they posed for the Romans was kind of economical, because they were essentially the only entity in between Rome and China that could absorb most of the Silk Road, even though there were various branches in the goods, and that the Romans tried to not even to invade, because the Iranian Plateau was useless to invade, as many areas where the Romans didn't venture, but simply to make it crumble. The Romans made it twice with the Parthians, so that basically they wanted to make the internal, the unity of this kingdom to collapse and to make it turn into several principalities. Was kind of easy to do relatively, after a big defeat, because the Iranian Plateau was basically this set of kind of almost feudal principalities, also very diverse within itself. The only problem was it was environmentally tough. The Romans never thought to invade, I mean, to conquer Persia on a stable ground. They just wanted to crush it, especially when Persia began to shift the core of its power into Mesopotamia, that had this ability, where the capital Ctesiphon was, and where the Parthians wanted to basically, I mean, the Persians wanted to rebuild fundamentally and this ancient legacy based on, not on this kind of feudal world, but sort of a firmly sedentary, bureaucratic empires founded on cities, on permanent army, etc. Well, the Romans kind of had the upper hand most of the times. Even in Constantinian times, the military reforms were quite effective to counter the Persians at that time. Under the Sasanian dynasty, had fundamentally a very they were the greatest foe, the most powerful foe the Romans were facing, even from a tactical point of view. But Rome was always kind of the strongest. You know, the main problem for the Romans at that point was the last war with the Persians, the one between the end of 6th and the beginning of 7th century, into which, yeah, Rome risked. I mean, Constantinople at that time risked, but in previous times, especially in early early Roman imperial times, the Parthian threat was kind of minimal, and they weren't able to. The Parthians weren't fundamentally able to exploit even things like the Jewish revolts or something like that. They had those limits in those years, so they were kind of marginal. Given other political entities, you realize that practically they did not exist. I mean, any major political entities. The Romans were aware of the existence of countries like India, China, Ethiopia, but these were very far away lands. There were many legions about them. There was this kind of vague understanding that, and even contacts and communication. The Romans and the Chinese definitely exchanged embassies quite often. We know this, but you know, they were too far from each other to, at least from the Roman perspective, to put into discussion the universal character of the Roman purposes, the Roman aims. The Roman Empire and the Chinese Empire never came to, you know, in contrast with each other. They fundamentally all had their own spaces. They had, obviously, China was thinking the same about itself on the Pacific. So that's it. So this is the real perspective, and naturally the Romans knew practically nothing of the American continents across the ocean. And even though many scholars were in the ancient world were, you know, could discuss on the theoretical possibility that at the antipodes of the world there could be other lands, other peoples. And in fact, in the mid-1st century AD, the famed philosopher and writer Lucius Annaeus Seneca, born in 4 BC and died in 65 AD, in his tragedy Medea, had almost prophetically stated that there would come centuries loaded in with years, into which the ocean would open fundamentally the barriers of things, and a great world would appear, and the sea could in fact show and reveal new lands. So this was, and naturally here, as I was saying, we should open a huge parenthesis about the Romans. Just thinking that the Romans had, however, a knowledge just of those lands where they could go, even just as merchants, etc. I mean, we know of Roman temples and settlements in the western coast of India, for instance. There was a temple dedicated to Augustus in Malabar, for instance. And there were Romans who surely ventured up to the Southeast Asia, even to China. So the Romans were kind of more aware of that than much closer lands like Russia, for instance. The Romans ignored, at least geographically speaking, the existence of Russia. And why? Because nobody entered there, because they were not interested. While actually the Roman Empire was known, and Roman artifacts arrived up to the Urals, fundamentally, the Romans didn't give a damn about those lands. And they were relatively close, also because the Romans expanded as far, they seized the Crimea. They were pretty interested into the Ukrainian and Caucasian grain, because that was very important for the city supplies of an empire. It was fundamentally based on cities, even though actually the majority of the Roman population, obviously, as in any pre-industrial society, lived into the countryside. But this is the point. The Romans were mostly a pragmatic people. They were interested exclusively in what worked effectively. Also in here, many people say, oh, well, no, the Romans were so kind of rough. They even blocked an alleged scientific revolution that was taking place into Greece. They could have invented the steam engine. They even knew about bullshit. This is complete bullshit for anyone who has a minimal understanding of history of technology. Of course, the Romans knew steam engine. The Greeks had invented it. The Romans invaded those lands, and there was some kind of knowledge of it, but to pretend that the Industrial Revolution would occur fundamentally 1 millennium in advance, just because they knew about the steam engine, is simply not understanding how technology really works, what the economical potential of the ancient world really was, and why especially the Industrial Revolution and the Scientific Revolution and the Industrial Revolution occurred in the times where they occurred, in the 17th and the 18th century. The Romans did extremely well with the resources that they had, and there was no way at the time to build. There were no resources, no potential, no economical convenience to structure their economy with building machines that require an enormous amount of cost. There was also a problem of components. There were no sheer volume of traffics that could make the Romans need a technology like that. It's not because it was about slavery. All the world at the time worked like with slavery, and slavery didn't end because someone woke up in the morning and said, let's use machines instead of slaves. It's something that occurred through very different dynamics, and were mostly rooted in the abundance of surplus. It's not a surprise that the Industrial Revolution, the mechanical loom and all this stuff, emerged in England in the 18th century, because England at the time had a surplus of resources coming from colonialism, hence also from slavery, and that pushed certain people to invent certain mechanical devices, because fundamentally the working force was not, the human labor was not enough to exploit all that material. That's how it happened. In Roman times there was nothing like that. We like to magnify classical economy, and especially stressing how the Middle Ages that followed was this moment of terrible darkness where everything collapsed, where economy went back. No, actually, ancient economy, medieval economy are pretty similar, and I think great part of the Middle Ages it was even more advanced productively than the ancient time. I mean, look at Europe, even 13th century Europe, that's quite evenly more dynamic, resourceful, and with a higher potential than Antony in Rome. That's quite self-evident. But aside from that, the this is the point. I think the Romans really did well with what they had. And generally speaking, most of societies did well with what they had. Naturally, there were certain dynamics that didn't really, that were too, I hate theological interpretations, but let's say this system was finite, fundamentally. And also the crisis of the Roman Empire, its progressive decline, have to do with certain dynamics that couldn't be stopped for the time, fundamentally. So let's take a look at some of them. So, as we've seen, the balance of the empire was internally entrusted fundamentally to the relation that existed between the prince and the people/army. This was at least the original idea. It was mostly like an emperor now dealing with certain classes of were the most productive within the Roman society. That also, were the ones that made part that made up or had made up the army back in the day. Also, here there is a geographical evolution as this the Roman citizenship is extended progressively through the military service also outside Italy, and it starts involving other aristocracies within the Senate. There are resistances and so on. So everything was based partly also on this progress. And I would say the most progressive forces, like in fact Caesar had been, or even Claudius, or even Nero, etc. In this sense, push for, the empire was functional as long as this expansion could occur, but this extension could occur. But this extension naturally had some limits. Another important part of the imperial bonds was founded on slavery. Slavery economy fundamentally, and this entailed necessarily new and continuous conquests that were necessary in this sense to provide society with this kind of with this raw material, as bad as it sounds, that produced a sort of propulsive energy. That was the free work of slaves. Slavery in the Roman Empire has naturally a this complex history. Slavery was not only the same fashion, let's say, but this in early Roman in early imperial times, we can say that slavery was kind of its most at its highest peak, in the sense of real concrete enslavement of conquered peoples who were brought in, sold, and sent to work, mostly in the Roman latifundia. It is true that not all slaves lived that bad. Slaves were recognized some rights. They even had the possibility of freeing themselves at one point. But it should be noted that most of Roman slaves, as most of slaves elsewhere, were fundamentally treated as non-human beings. They were called actually instrumenta vocalia, which means vocal instruments, vocal tools, essentially. So it renders an idea, and most of them were definitely employed en masse into in the estates, of the senatorial estates, as we've said, and that was not much different from a concentration camp. That's obvious. We have terrible accounts on the living conditions and the appalling conditions of the slaves in these contexts. Those fundamentally those corporals that directed the slave work, slave labor, were usually former slaves, ex-slaves. So the so-called liberti, that however were remarkably harsher even than, freemen in dealing with slaves as well. But there was a transformation of slavery for which that really was meant to occur. Most of these slaves were freed progressively over time. I mean, over generations, naturally not. Most of the slaves that were, that became slave in their life would not be freed, but maybe their children would, because on the long run, these were people who were living next to all the others. So also in here, it was not a gratuitous cruelty. It was really the functionality of these people to a certain work. Progressively, these people got Romanized. They got also kind of, just think a slave that you capture in a faraway land, you bring in here. This person is not able to speak your language, is usually, also relatively wild for your costume. So there was probably even a sort of motivation for conceiving them in this kind of negative sense. So the ancient world was a very dark world in many ways. But progressively, there was also the idea that the Romans were kind of civilizers in this sense. This is all the more evident when Rome ceases to also to let's say has difficulties to access new slaves, and also where the demographic crisis brings to a sort of need for alive people. The Romans sometimes slaughtered entire tribes and entire populations because maybe they had meant to spend. They didn't care. Towards the later empire, this practice came to be less frequent because the Romans needed labor force. They needed people alive to make them work, to repopulate certain desolated areas, to make them pay taxes, to transfer. So in fact, some of the, if you take Theodosian propaganda, after even the Roman defeat of Adrianople, where eventually the Visigoths were entered as kind of unique people, excuse me, within the Roman Empire, was that, I mean, the greatest ambition of the emperor at that point was the one of civilizer. The one who, instead of defeating the barbarians and slaughtering, simply was so merciful and good that he settled them in certain lands and transformed them into peasants. So this was a great miracle, a great blessing, and so on. But in the early imperial times, definitely slavery was the propulsor of the empire, really, literally. Not all what we see from even Roman monuments has been built by slaves. Seemingly, even monuments as the Colosseum seemingly were built by salaried workers, specialized working force, craftsmen, etc. However, the real engine of Roman economy was naturally agriculturalism. So that's where most of the slave working force was employed. So, as we have seen, the Romans needed to conquer other peoples to get new slaves. Yeah, sometimes they bought them from those same peoples. This happened at all times. The peoples that lived beyond, say out of the empire, were usually tribal populations that were in constant war with each other, and therefore there was always a very florid market of slaves that came from those lands. And Roman conquests, however, had this major aim, and together with naturally seizing certain mineral centers, thinking about Dacia, there were major reasons, but at a certain point also the Roman Empire ceases to expand because it overstretches fundamentally. So also controlling certain lands was becoming increasingly difficult. Think about Germany. The Romans conquered Germany and they rule over it for a generation or so, and after the Battle of Teutoburg Forest they say, okay, let's get out of here, because it's fundamentally, you know, they could have struck back, and the Romans planned other 2 times fundamentally to invade Germany, because they were probably still not. Germany was a kind of a border line land that could theoretically be, but at the end they decided it was better not to do so. I will definitely make a video one day to explain why the Romans bailed out of Germany, and in more, you know, concrete and realistic terms than the ones that you often hear. I wouldn't say them from a national perspective, but generally speaking, also in you know, for the reasons you wouldn't. It's like with Scotland fundamentally. You know, what do you think, that the Romans didn't have the military potential to occupy that land? It was a problem of costs and benefits, and that's it. The Romans were not stupid. They didn't go to conquer someone that they thought they couldn't. You know, the Romans thought about the consequences of their actions. It happens most of the time. So if you want to understand that, and that's really the starting point, you want to take into consideration. Naturally, the Roman conquests brought into the within the empire many riches, and that were under the form either of booty of war, fundamentally, that in fact, yeah, there could be precious metals, slaves, and naturally incorporating certain lands into the empire meant to also extend the Roman taxation over many cultivated areas. And in fact, if you look at the borders of, you know, the frontiers of the empire, you realize that the Romans expanded exactly into those lands that could support an agricultural system, a consistent agricultural system. Everybody who lived outside the empire, in fact, was either nomadic or semi-nomadic, because the local economy couldn't support something greater than a village in terms of surplus, etc. So the Romans definitely thought it was better not to occupy those lands, because it would have been a problem to maintain, for instance, legions in there that necessitated of a huge amount of supplies, and that couldn't be found locally. So also in here we should reconceive also what we mean by Roman frontiers, because the Romans had a military deterrent that was enough also to kind of freeze most of the political situation, also in lands that they didn't occupy directly. In fact, Germany, that is taken like the outside, but frankly the Romans knew the Germans pretty well, and vice versa, and the legions of the Rhine were posed there not because it was thought that, you know, Gaul was inside the empire and Germany was outside. The Romans thought that the Rhine legions had to stay there to check fundamentally both the Germans and the Gauls at the same time. So realized that also many provinces where Rome formally extended its empire were not that much Romanized. There were many areas, if you take the west, I don't know, northern Spain or Bretagne in Gaul, or great parts of Britain, or even Illyria in the along the Danube, etc., weren't much Roman. I mean, they remained for centuries under Rome, but, you know, the degree of Romanization was rather low. Because in fact the Roman Empire was really an empire, fundamentally. It was since the very beginning. It was the idea that you settle in there with legions to keep under control certain troops. And also, you see how the way the legions were disposed, and they were put usually on those crossroads to cover, you know, several directions at once in potential. I mean, to run there and or there to counter eventual rebellions, and that was it. There were Roman officials that naturally exacted tolls and all this stuff, and that's how more or less it worked. Then there was also a big deal of decentralized rule. Think about all the Roman client states were out there in the frontiers that had relations with Rome, that naturally had, especially in the elites, a great interest to be Roman partners, because it was mostly, trading with the empire was meant to have huge markets open to your trade as well. So, and it was also still the military threat, the idea that there were certain powers you might use Rome to be defended by, or simply that maybe you would have liked to sneak out, but Rome was too powerful and they didn't want that. Rome was usually the next door's bully most of the time. They even certain Pacific donations. Think about the kingdom of Pergamon, of the Attalids and so on. We see them kind of a peaceful nature, but there were extortions at best, and this was normal for any for any political entity at the time to behave like that. And after all, in this sense, the ways the empire controlled other lands were not fundamentally so different in the military practice from what other peoples, other empires did. So also in here, it's much more important to understand the internal political and social balance rather than how the mean really was. Obviously, the Roman military is quite attractive for us, but in the essentials, it was nothing excessively, special. I know it sounds bad, because I found out there people were truly convinced that the Romans had the kind of, in conditions of symmetry, the strongest military in history, but this is not really the truth. And even the populations against which the Romans fought weren't that enormously inferior to the Romans. For instance, from a tactical point of view, then of course logistically and in terms of organization, of course, that's what made the Romans great. But just yesterday we were talking about physical force and violence in von Clausewitz, and that's pretty much it. You can, as von Clausewitz says, you can cover that violence can be armed with art and science, etc., to go against other violence, but fundamentally the nature it's always still kind of the same. And these were worlds where the asymmetry between different populations that seem so different from us at our eyes, like the Romans or the Germans, for instance, telling the truth, were very, very low. Very low. The military, as we were saying before, made up fundamentally the greatest element of the Roman state, the greatest bulk, the greatest chunk of the Roman state, in terms of expenses and so on. So Rome was rightfully an empire because it extended its control through its military her military machine. There was the necessity, naturally, of conscription. At this time, in the early Roman Empire, the military was largely, there was largely a volunteer recruitment. There were no recruitment problems. Fundamentally, there was no epidemic crisis. There were enough soldiers to recruit. Of course, in times of emergency, there could be forced conscription that never quite ended. So, however, there was all a military machine working for these recruits. Soldiers had to be deployed in foreign lands. They had to remain there for essentially for centuries. Even, I mean, not the single soldiers, of course, but the idea is that there are certain legions. If you look at their history, they were deployed in certain places where they remained stationed for centuries. And in fact, from those same Roman camps, we have there were cities being built. This is famously known. So there was all an evolution also in this of the kind of the permanent nature of the army that Augustus had formally sanctioned. You know that the Roman army before the Marian reforms, at least in theory, was kind of a unprofessional militia that was recruited only every once in a while. Telling the truth, this had not been quite the truth since the Second Punic War, as there were certain soldiers who were already kind of professionals, who were making a living out of the military service. Then there is the 1st century BC. There is this troubled moment of civil war, civil intestine strife, for which great part of the Roman, male, able-bodied population was recruited into war. Augustus basically sanctions the formal professionalization and permanence of the Roman army, of the legions that were stationed along the borders and so on. I mean the borders. It's wrong to call them borders, actually, as we've said before. The Romans didn't quite even use much the term limes that we often use ourselves for talking about the Roman, alleged Roman borders. They mostly use the term munimentum, which means essentially this fortification on that worked as a deterrent force all around. So there was not a single line that naturally, that these forces were stationed mostly along natural borders, great rivers of Central Europe, along other frontiers, mountains and deserts and so on. But that's just because of a contingental, evident reason. I mean, you can be better protected by a river and something like that, create problems for the enemy from a strategical point of view as well as a tactical one. But the concept is that you can extend your force well beyond that, and the enemy can, in theory. So the Romans never quite had a linear border, and however this the fortification of this border is something that progresses fundamentally during the centuries. So these soldiers were stationed on frontiers, were fundamentally rewarded with relatively modest but however safe distributions of land in full property. So this is how the legionnaires were practically paid at the end of the service. Previously they received a salary, but they mostly had in theory that had to also to absorb part of the military costs in theory, because de facto it was a salary. But naturally were in this process the Romans had also the auxiliaries that made at all times in Roman history the greatest part of the Roman forces, numerically speaking. These were known citizens that were into Roman service and to win citizenship fundamentally, and they were quite used to war. So as tribesmen, as populations that lived across the frontiers and were now maybe having been just Romanized, so they had this fresh need for making a living into a safer way, and eventually being transformed into Romans over the generations. As we were saying, the Romans extended to up as long as the geoclimatical limits would allow, fundamentally. The only place where the only area where the Romans stopped because they were halted in a certain sense was the east, in part, as we've seen with the Parthians, because the Parthians, in fact, were not much difficult to defeat. In actual fact, the Romans conquered Mesopotamia. The problem... this damn car alarm. Wait a second. Is it possible all the noises happen while I'm recording? Damn it. Because the Roman dream, it was the same Alexandrian one, to conquer India, fundamentally. Augustus wanted to conquer India, even if the Romans didn't know much about the actual physical borders of India, but that was a quite reasonable strategical goal for any great empire would stretch, in fact, over the Near East and had other resources to invest. But the problem, in fact, was the Iranian Plateau. There was another land where the Romans wouldn't venture, geoclimatically speaking, because they couldn't keep it. But there was a thorn on the side, because if you want to go across Mesopotamia and eventually go into those lands, essentially between in south would be today's southern Persia and southern Iran and far to India, you have always this kind of side that is exposed. So that's kind of the only case in which theoretically the Romans could have expanded more, because there was enough room and enough the right environmental conditions for doing it, but they were kind of contained. But also in there, it's not much that they were actively contained, it's simply that they had other problems that they wanted to. Fundamentally, the main Roman strategical goal was to keep secure the Mediterranean. As long as they kept secure the Mediterranean, they made enough money with trade, etc. So also the Roman military was not really a useless expense of money. I mean, even at the heyday of the empire, the moment of greatest economical prosperity, the Roman army was not excessively numerous. It was always contained, because even costs, you have to think that taxation in the Roman Empire was extremely low, like in most of the ancient and medieval world, and it's now that we're used even to tens of points of percentage in taxation. It's just, for an ancient person, it would have been absurd. So even the resources were relatively limited, and even the economical potential wasn't that much. Of course, Rome managed immense amounts of wealth, and therefore they could scrap a bit at the top in order to build things like, in fact, the monuments that we observe. But compared to the whole wealth, that most of this wealth was had necessarily to be redistributed, to be consumed, because most of the ancient economy was at a survival, was a kind of a survival economy, fundamentally. So also in there couldn't be a sort of undetermined, undefined growth that would make the Romans rocket to the moon or to Mars. So you have to understand what limits, the physical limits of that world really were. And talking about the frontiers, these limits of Roman expansions were reached fundamentally from the end of the 1st century and the beginning of the 2nd. And naturally we're talking about the time of the Empire of Trajan, that whose rule was in fact considered one of the most serene and safe times of history of civilization, fundamentally. Even though Trajan, even though the Trajan's empire saw the greatest geographical extension of the empire, really the best time in terms of quality of life in Rome's history was the Antonine period, fundamentally before the plague of Marcus Aurelius, before the Marcomannic Wars, etc. That was the best time in absolute terms to be a Roman. Even if the frontiers at that time had already contracted a little bit, especially in the east, as Mesopotamia had been abandoned. But that's fundamentally it. But it's in fact already during the course of the 2nd century that the general picture began, albeit very slowly and imperceptibly at the beginning, to deteriorate. The crisis of the Roman Empire. Why? The decline of the Roman Empire. As we were saying before, I think the most important question we should pose is, not much why the empire collapsed, but how could it last so long? I think an advice, and it's how I used to see most of history indeed, is to realize that every political entity is always pretty unstable. I mean, even these millenary empires that we observe in history were never kind of to be given for granted. Of course, if they lasted for millennia, sometimes it's because they evidently had some solid bases. But at the same time, if you look in detail at their history, many things could occur to reverse this situation. This is particularly evident, especially in Byzantine times. Rome at this time lived so long also because it didn't actually meet very threatening enemies after all. I mean, if during the 1st and 2nd century AD, the greatest foe the Romans could meet were the Parthians, so you understand that this wasn't much of a deal. Don't talk about the Germans, because the Germans in these centuries were kind of, some of the most backward populations, etc. So even if they had, they were consistently rebellious, etc., they weren't a threat for Rome. And then things start to change because also the German society starts to change, etc. But at this time there was no evident enemy. The Romans had wiped out everyone, literally, and the greatest enemies of Rome had been in the Mediterranean, by the way. So had been other civilizations that had, they were quite advanced and sophisticated, if you want. Think about Carthage, think about the Hellenistic empires, etc. So this explains quite a lot. Just imagine to have to rule an empire. There is not much of a military activity, if not in the easternmost area of the easternmost border, where your enemies are not even able to, to expugnate to storm a city, because they lack even the logistic polytheistic knowledge. For instance, how the Parthians were mocked in the ancient world for this. Even the peoples of the steppes at the time were quite relatively on their own. They didn't have any kind of threatening aim towards the empire. And there were still kind of tribes or confederations. I mean, nothing extremely powerful. Excuse me, I drink a little bit. So, the crisis. Why the crisis? Well, there is, I think, say there is a shortcut that is often used in historiography. Everybody says, there has been some great environmental change, mostly a climatic coldening. So climate at the time started to go towards a long phase of coldening in the boreal hemisphere of the planet, which would touch its apex around the 6th and 7th centuries, which in fact are regarded as the moments of greatest contraction of Eurasian, the Eurasian world. It's where basically our Middle Ages start. Ideally, someone calls them even the Dark Ages. That's something so terrible. It might as well be so. I mean, climatic changes are very important, especially in those contexts into which, as we've seen, economy is so relatively weak and its potential is very low. So even a few variations in, a variation in a few degrees of temperature can lead to, structural changes that really affect even civilizations as a consequence. The planet Earth has its astronomic cycles, for which even its axis kind of shifts. This periodically brings to, in fact, different exposures to the sunlight. So this causes normally variations in some degrees, but so it's perfectly plausible, and I'm personally convinced that also some of the greatest changes in human history have been triggered by climatic changes as well. But this is not all, and if you study the history, in this case of the empire, you realize that there were so many factors that, albeit in part maybe triggered by such greater environmental changes, could really have very different consequences depending on what the political, so something non-structural but decisional fundamentally, orientation might have taken. As we were saying before, in my opinion, the Western Roman Empire was not meant to fall. Another thing that is often overlooked when we talk about the so-called barbarian invasions is that the barbarians, let's say, were suffering of these environmental problems as much, if not more, than the Romans. The Romans were a sedentary society. They occupied some of the most productive and fertile land of the world at the point. They had stocks, they had infrastructures, they had also these Mediterranean connections, made traffics quite quick. The Germans and other populations were kind of semi-nomadic at that point. They didn't have much to live off. They had necessarily to fight, to loot, to survive. There were a few people also. So also when they settled into the former Roman lands, it's not that they were faring particularly well. Just thinking about, what the Visigoths were in Spain when Majoranus went to conquer them. They basically surrendered. And if it hadn't been for the Roman defeat against the Vandals, the Visigoths would have been redeployed somewhere else, or at least. So it's really, climatic change doesn't take into account what the political and military events eventually turn like. Just think about if the Battle of Adrianople had not occurred, the history of the empire might have been quite different. The Battle of Adrianople was not really even there the determining factor of the fall of the West. Things might have taken another path, definitely, but surely if the Romans had won at Adrianople, maybe they would have saved way more energies, they would have had much less internal problems. History would have surely gone in very different ways, even radically different ways, from that point onwards. However, there is this generally speaking, there is this economical crisis. It seems that the crop rate went down for some reason that can be as well as climatic, as we have seen. Therefore, the levels of nutrition and the economical conditions, especially of the lower social classes, went dramatically down, and this brought down also the immunitary defenses. So epidemics were favored by this context, and also by other reasons, because fundamentally the empire had not met before the Antonine plague any other major with epidemics. So this means, epidemiologically speaking, that if a population of tens of millions is not exposed to massive epidemics for centuries, also the physiological defense of human beings goes down. It's less used to cope with this illnesses, and the immunitary system grows weaker. So it's easier to strike eventually. And considering also that Roman cities were so well crowded, interconnected, so also the spread of such illnesses was relatively easier than, say, in a rural environment. It's part of the reason why also the decline of the Roman cities occurred, because you would be likely to flee a city where an epidemic has broken out. So if you had the means, you could do it. So people ate less, they had a worse nutrition, and they were their lifestyle, their life quality was going down. This is also very, this had also much to do with the way Roman society was structured. Like, we know that the Roman Empire was famous for its juridical system, etc., but it still was not really an egalitarian world. I mean, you could have justice fundamentally in with much more difficulty if you were poor than if you were rich. Rome, as we've seen, the emperors, especially the first century AD, and in this early Roman Empire, had tried to favor the middle class of, let's say, it would be the gentry fundamentally in some way, of the equites, for instance, and other middle class meant to. They were the entrepreneurial core of Roman society, to counter the stagnating latifundia-based senatorial system. So what happens is that on the long run, especially with this economical crisis, etc., those who can, throughout all the empire, the senators had increased their wealth fundamentally because of their privileged political and social condition, and now with the economical crisis, the middle classes also begin to decline. So fundamentally, this brings also to an active subjugation of the lower classes to the elite, to the aristocracies fundamentally. So there were always fewer richer people, and way more poorer people. So this changes a lot. It's something you can see even from the Roman art, in the first centuries of the empire. Usually human figures of Romans, etc., were all kind of same size, stressing in the political equality and all this stuff. Eventually, towards the 3rd century, you start seeing, that there are certain masters, certain domini that were kind of represented as larger individuals, and the others were all following. So this stresses the importance, the intensification of the clientelary system had always been at the base of the Roman society. Roman society had always been kind of like that. It had always been the oligarchies of the rich and these masses of poor people. But especially when the middle class begins to disappear, to thin down, you realize that's never quite of a good moment for society. And also certain political turns occur. So that's also why, in part, the Augustean system starts to waver, because that was based also on a very delicate balance between the aristocracies, the middle classes, the plebs, and so on. So now, without the middle classes, you have just an aristocracy who rules over these masses of peasants, etc., and that is able to exercise an ever greater control over these masses, and to structure society accordingly. There is the demographic crisis. The barbarian invasions kind of begin. So war causes destruction, depopulation. The epidemics kind of finish this process as well, and complete this process as well. So large parts of the empire, especially in the rural areas, went depopulated. So never to forget, as we were saying before, that this crisis was occurring also outside the Roman world. So in Central Asia and at the borders of the empire, these entire nomadic populations whose economy and survival depended on the pastures of horses, camels, and of sheep and stuff like that, also contracted. It brought to these peoples to get on the move. That's how it fundamentally happened. It happened in many parts of the world. It was the whole Eurasian world that now was put into movement. from at many levels. This is something you find huge movements of huge nomadic confederations into Central Asia were a really big thing. But this starts happening at a local level, even in places like Germany. All the various tribes start once again to put themselves into motion. The Romans had stemmed successfully since the 1st century BC the Germanic expansion. That, you know, this is also quite overlooked as a thing. The Romans stopped, for instance, the Teutonic migration. They also stopped the Swabians to invade. They prevented the Swabians from invading Gaul, as Caesar basically annihilated them, and also made this quite effective show-off, massacring an entire population across the Rhine. So from there on, the Germans had been kind of scared, and they had stopped their movements. And the Romans, in fact, had passed on the offensive and conquered Germany, and then the Germans make it to rebel, and the Romans back off. But the Germans remain fundamentally, aside from some, you know, small incursion here and there, due to certain tribal, you know, clashes and stuff like that into the Roman borders, nothing serious had happened. With the Marcomannic Wars, that starts once again something bigger. They're not even single. They're not single bands of mountaineers and get into Roman territory to pillage and so on. They start becoming, you know, confederations, some certain organized groups that put themselves into motion because they have no other way to survive within within their lands, because resources are lacking. So that's how it basically started. So you can't, looking at on the bigger picture, you have from this semi-nomadic world of Eurasia many populations that start to move towards the peripheral areas of the Eurasian continent that were favored by a milder maritime climate. So where the effects of the cooling of the climate were lower, and where there were enough resources to survive. So this was really this movement, the so-called barbarian invasions, were really triggered mostly by this internal, say, this worldwide dynamic. And these peoples were, you know, up to that point, they had been content with what they had. There was no reason to expose themselves to annihilation, to retaliation in the case of the Romans. These invasions, the Romans thought at a point to launch. I mean, Marcus Aurelius was about to, before to die, just to invade Germany once again. Maximinus the Thracian thought about it too. So when the Germans start to, you know, to agitate, the Romans think about intervening once again into Germany. So this tells you also what the Roman approach to the Germans really was, the Roman mindset towards those populations was. It's self-evident, I would say, that these movements were felt by the two great empires that were facing respectively the Pacific and the Atlantic Ocean at this point, as the Roman and the Chinese Empire were these two great empires inhabited by sedentary populations, were mostly into agriculture. It's interesting because these populations kind of reacted in a similar way to this threat. At this point, also the Persians were about to face this problem, because the Persians had this kind of they came from the steppes, originally speaking, so they also maintained this feudal mindset in the Iranian Plateau, and that was also pretty fluid, where many semi-nomadic, when not openly nomadic, tribes were settled in there. So, but even in there, they had their own frontier at one point, especially the Sassanid Persians that create something more structured, more consistent, have their problems with the Huns as well. The Romans faced the black Huns, the Persians faced the white Huns. So it's easy. It's interesting to compare these powers. Excuse me, I drink a little bit. These empires reacted in the same way to stem, or at least to discipline this new for them incomprehensible and however dangerous migratory fluxes. So the Chinese Empire builds this enormous infrastructure that is the Great Wall of China, that is roughly 6,500 kilometers long, that actually was already erected by the Emperor Shi Huangdi in between 229 and 221 BC to keep at bay the peoples of the steppes. The Romans react in a relatively different way, because for them there is no need to actually stop this huge amount of very dangerous and offensive steppes peoples like the Chinese had. The Romans had a kind of a lower threat on their frontiers, so they start building certain so-called valla in Latin, that were these continuous wall curtains that were sometimes several tens of kilometers long, through which they reinforce these areas of the so-called limes. That the limes actually defined, I believe, the roads that stretch along what we think it was kind of the border. So this road was naturally meant to especially connect all the main centers of the frontier, to facilitate the army movement, and along this road are built this kind of fortifications, especially in those areas that naturally were perceived as particularly exposed. The European borders were kind of European valla were substantially different from the Eastern ones, from the African ones. So it really depended on the kind of threat they had to meet. For instance, on the African border, you never find this kind of fortifications. The African border was relatively of low intensity one, as Luttwak says. Luttwak is an interesting read, but the great strategy of the Roman Empire is very interesting, but it's still, you have to bear in mind that he has in mind more 20th century United States of America than actually the Roman Empire, first centuries AD Roman Empire. But nevertheless, it's a very interesting read. We will have to make a video on Luttwak, the great strategy of the Roman Empire, to understand what's really wrong with it. But it's really beautiful if you want to read, if you're interested in this topic, you want to start from the beginning, give it a try. Also, the great strategy of the Byzantine Empire is very interesting as well. But let's say that this limes was very different naturally from the Great Chinese Wall, for instance. So, for instance, Trajan built a vallum on the Danube between today's Bulgaria and Romania. There is the also famous Adrian Wall, built between 122 and 128 to defend the northern border of Roman Britain, that more or less stretches, corresponds more or less to the one between today's England and Scotland, and it's 120 kilometers long. there is the fortified limits along the Rhine. The Rhine frontier, and it has been kind of quite turbulent, also the Danubian one. But, for instance, in the case of the Rhine, that you realize that this was never transformed into a continuous fortification. It was essentially a system of various palisades, forts, watchtowers. Also, nature still corresponded a little bit to made up of the work, with steep cliffs, and with the Rhine itself, so it was not necessary to build a continuous wall like in Scotland or in those other small trades across the Carpathians. Nevertheless, the Rhine volume was 280 kilometers long, so that's also an impressive work of military engineering. So, in the bigger picture, in perspective, you realize that all these closing and fortification of the frontiers corresponded to the Roman awareness that the time of conquests and of expansion of the empire was over. This was figured out already in Trajan, as we've seen before, had kind of overstretched the empire. Hadrian comes after draws back, and Hadrian is often considered it's typical to read from, I don't know, the internet, say the internet as a place. The guy who says, Adrian Wall, Adrian got it all wrong, Rome had to continue expanding, because he didn't understand about war, it was a mistake, no, this is completely false. Hadrian, first of all, was a very competent military mind. He had a very strong relation with the military. He visited the legions on the frontiers very often. He was a quite smart man. He understood that Trajan had overstretched the empire. He didn't give up the concept of invasion. He simply thought that most of the time, at that point there was no need. Even, Roman conquests weren't something that happened like as a continuation. Invasions were launched every once in a while, even in centuries. It's not something you do all the time. So even on the bigger picture, it obviously the Roman Empire had kind of expanded up to this point. But if you count the time and you observe the frequency of Roman expansions, well, that's something that took a lot. So this fortification was nevertheless important because it was effective. This is also another point that is often overlooked. People say, "Oh well, but eventually the barbarians made it to conquer the empire." Yeah, but this had nothing to do with the direction that the empire had taken from a military point of view. This had to do mostly with political problems, internal political problems of the empire, of the endemic dynamics, socio-economical dynamics. So this has nothing strictly to do with the efficiency of the Roman military or the strategical decisions of the empire. The Romans did well all the time. Fundamentally, they did their own mistakes as well, but sometimes they were kind of forgivable, and also in their history might have relatively taken another path. Just think about if the Romans had not, if Varus had not fallen into the ambush of the Theodorburg forest. I don't think that necessarily the Germans would have achieved such an amazing victory, thanks to such an effective leader like Arminius in a short time once again. So from that, history might have been very, very different, and it has been. indeed. Maybe, I don't know, maybe the conquest of Germany would have created on the long run more problems to the empire than any positive benefit. The Romans had ideally, in fact, decided at that point to maintain the limits on the Elbe River, not on the Rhine. So, but that proved that it was not kind of a good choice, because that equated to expose their back to the German rebellions, and that's how it went, and the Romans withdrew from there. So history, things can take very different turns depending even on small events. However, this general fortification of the limits is also doesn't have to be necessarily overly emphasized. It's not that the Romans really entrenched themselves into the limes. The limes was always kind of open, kind of fluid. The Romans kept settling peoples that wanted to come in, because we have seen that they needed labor force to work the fields and so on. And generally speaking, especially when you read Luttwak, for instance, it gives you the impression as if the early Roman Empire was about creating this continuous limes, and then eventually the situation collapses, and therefore the Romans create this so-called defense in depth. But the defense in depth was really present at all times. I mean, actually, all defenses at that time were in depth. This valla, these walls, were fundamentally meant to stop what Luttwak calls low-intensity incursions. It was like on the African frontier. In Africa there wasn't any major political, any major threat, but this kind of semi-nomadic mountaineers of the desert. And because in the Sahara you don't have the resources to build up a florid empire, right, that can't threaten. And so the Romans basically built a fence, like a ditch and a fence, and the only objective of that is not that the Berbers couldn't pour in, but they had to waste time breaking it, and they didn't have to waste time opening larger gaps. So basically the Romans counted on the garrisons to signal that these guys had come in to raid, and therefore they would close the fence where the enemy had broken, and they would have bottled them inside, and they would have caught them and slaughtered. But even on the Valla, on the Rhine or the Danube, or even the fortification that were kind of more contiguous, as we've seen, they were never a continuous wall, but they had a continuity in for fortresses of this signaling system, etc. For these fences and palisades, etc., were not meant to stop big armies. They were not. The Chinese wall was meant to stop big armies. The Romans didn't care about that, chiefly because they didn't face big armies. Secondly, also because in fact this was the most economical way to do it, in terms of costs, benefits. And because if a big army had poured in, well, that's where you call the legions to meet them in open field. And still, however, when a bigger army, enemy army, gets into your own territory, it's better to have all these various fortresses scattered here and there from which you can harass the enemy and attack his lines of communications, supply lines, etc. And in fact, many Germans, especially on the Rhine and the Danube, the main foes were the Germans at that point, weren't even were attacked only when they had already pillaged and they were burdened by the loot, and that's where the Romans attacked and they wiped them out. So it's difficult sometimes to understand strategy, but just for saying that even this myth of the Roman walls is something that was kind of exception. The norm was in the Roman world to have this kind of defense in depth with scattered forts and watchtowers in order to eventually intervene, and more importantly, having this continuous line of communication to know exactly when the enemy where the enemy was and how to attack it. For instance, on the eastern border, the Mesopotamian one, there wasn't a wall because the enemies were more mobile usually. So it was more effective to simply have this scattered force directly
also in Mesopotamia, aside from there was the Euphrates that also was fortified in part, but aside from that, also the nature there is kind of more, especially towards Syria, there is the desert, etc. So what you meet in there is kind of enemies that you can wear down more with guerrilla and skirmishes and so on, than blocking them in a single place, where it's also more difficult to stop them because maybe, aside from the Euphrates, there's no other major geographical border at that point. So this began to happen, and naturally towards the late Roman Empire, this defense in depth was enhanced, definitely. So there was a different direction in that sense, but it was nothing new. It was nothing really new, and it already existed in part as the standard way of. In fact, this is just for saying is that before these major fortifications the Romans built in those, the Roman frontier had remained, in fact, this scattered force for a defense in depth regularly. When the Romans conquered Gaul and they bordered with the Germans, and it's not that the Germans had changed their, military praxis. They did what they did usually as raiders and these incursions and so on. The Romans up to that point had been enough just to station legions in certain nevralgic points, and then having all this scattered force, etc. And there was need of a wall. No need for it, because the threat was so low that even just deterrence was enough sometimes to stop these guys. And if they went there, they intruded, they could have been easily caught by an effective signaling system and this combat-ready forces of cavalry, also of auxiliaries, but it was mostly a political thing. I mean, even before the military problem, it was a political problem of playing on the various Germanic tribes. Like half of the Germans was for Rome, the others was against, but not because they, respectively liked or disliked the Romans, but simply because, the places where they were settled favored, one alignment rather than the other, and so these raids are not isolated. They are into a frame. They're framed into a political system that already knows in advance what's going to happen fundamentally, and that's why, by the way, before the 3rd century, before the end of the 2nd century, most of these populations had remained fundamentally obedient. Roman the Pax Romana had been extended even beyond what we think as the Roman borders, in brackets. Nevertheless, now these fortifications showed that the Romans were aware of the new threats that were presented by the motion of the movement of these peoples, new movements of these peoples. Naturally, the Romans didn't understand much of what was happening in Central Asia. It's possible that these nomadic populations, as we were saying before, from the steppes, knew much more about Rome or China than what Rome and China knew about them. In fact, the Roman sources, also the Chinese sources, are relatively vague when they deal with these movements of populations, reason for which also historiographically we don't know that much about them. But it's obvious that, if you had been from the other side, at the head, I don't know, of the Huns, etc., you went back and forth from the Carpathians to the Chinese wall, this kind of populations that went very fastly from one side or the other. You realize that they had to know what it was there before going there, because otherwise they would have not done it. Obviously, also the nomadic perception of the Roman and Chinese Empire was quite approximate. Obviously, we don't have to think of spies everywhere. They knew everything. No, absolutely not. but still they had clear in mind, for instance, this this spatial dimension that the Roman and Chinese Empire completely lacked for those parts of North Eurasia. Also, what is very interesting, and I would like to stress, is that, in fact, it's how these peoples put themselves on the march relatively all of the sudden. So, for centuries, the Eurasian steppes, besides the local clashes between tribes and confederations, had remained fundamentally quiet, just like Germany, that we know best because it's better documented, because of the Romans observed the Germans were interested in them, but they were closer. But this gives you the systemic dimension of the problem. I mean, you understand that it's not that one barbarian chieftain woke up and said, okay, let's go pillage Rome or something like that. Absolutely not. These populations began to move because evidently there was some systemic factor that obliged them to move. And this was destabilizing the whole situation. For instance, the Romans were making a freaking lot of money with the trade with Central Europe in many ways. The Romans were not much worried when the Germanic tribes began to ferment once again and to move, etc. They were from a military point of view, they were mostly concerned about the fact that economy and trade now was finished, was being stopped. So there were less money coming into the Roman hands. So that was the primary reason why the Romans even thought about re-invading Germany. It wasn't much because a bunch of Germanic confederations now had invaded the borders, had, like the Marcomanni, had even arrived to Italy. The real problem there is that all the trade with Germany was jumped, was off, and I mean, not all of it, of course, but at least the major trade that had been stable up to that time now was being damaged. Excuse me, I drink a little once again. So, as a consequence, however, this produced destabilization even within the Roman political bounds, because naturally there was an economical crisis. It was difficult sometimes to counter these invasions all at a time. There was a demic crisis, so also the recruitment. Rome had not had recruitment problems substantially ever since the 2nd century BC. Up to the second half of the beginning of the 3rd century, the Romans had always had enough troops to send in. It was never a problem. Even in disasters like the one with Theodorburg Forest, the Romans, replaced all the fallen legionary. I mean, it was perfectly fine. Now, there was also a problem of manpower. Just recently I made a video, in fact, on the Simmachari in the Roman army. If you're interested, it deals with this fundamentally, because it talks exactly about this military, the different changes in Roman military organization and a Roman military recruitment across the frontiers. The name of the video is Simmachari/Simmachari, Rome's new foreign troops. Reason for which the Romans, rightfully, if you lack manpower and you don't have enough Roman citizens, you have to fight with someone. So just recruit those foreign troops that largely remain also sometimes faithful to Rome. I mean, Rome had constantly allies, even among these populations. So there was always someone who had interest to side with Rome, and the Romans were expert at playing on these divisions. But the real problem now was that there was a political imbalance also for what it concerned the leadership in Rome, because there were certain emperors that were acting and legislating in substantial agreement with the Senate, that represented the great landowners of the empire, whose properties were being threatened now by the barbarian invasions in many provinces. You know that the Romans, in the Augustean system, had basically sanctioned the differences in two main categories of province in the empire: the imperial province and the senatorial province. The imperial province was kind of a more strategically relevant province, like Egypt, for instance, that had a lot of grain that fed the Roman plebs, and also those regions, those provinces that were scattered along the borders, so the ones were more militarized in nature. And then the other, the core regions of the empire, the most fertile one, especially, Gaul, Spain, etc., that were instead the senatorial ones, because that were ruled practically by the senators, but these Roman governors were also landowners, and that's how Augustus had balanced the power of the central, say, authority, etc., and the kind of the private possessions of the senators. So now with the new militarization, the increase in military activity, etc., there were certain emperors that also were increasingly more tied to the army and their approval. For instance, Augustus, Claudius, and Trajan had been generally siding together with the senatorial interests, and others instead were stressing the kind of monarchical and sacred prerogatives of their rule. Even previously to this, to the crisis of this end of the second and beginning of the third century, there had been emperors who had been more sympathetic of the lower classes and of the empire, substantially siding against the conservative aristocracy. So, as we were saying before, also Roman historiography generally was the expression of certain privileged classes, read the senatorial ones, that were therefore extremely nostalgic towards the old republican order that was definitely idealized, because most of what we read about the old republican order, in fact, this idealization was created in imperial times. So there's also an underlying hypocrisy in the whole thing. Republican times were not that positive. Generally speaking, from a sociological point of view, it was a mess also in there. Think about the crisis of the Republic, etc. So even back in the day, it had always been pretty, politics has always been a dark affair. But the worst is that this historiography has given us a very negative picture of these emperors, stressing kind of the tyrannic aims that they wanted to stigmatize naturally, but that were overly emphasized in this sense. If you take, in fact, there was a saying before about Caligula and Nero, especially the way they were told by Tacitus, you realize that probably it's not a very accurate depiction of these emperors. On the contrary, telling the truth, Caligula was not mad at all. All the extravagances that are attributed to him are really just big resentment, a distortion fundamentally of certain show-offs that Caligula made in order to make the senators understand that they couldn't do whatever they wanted because he was the emperor and he decided what had to be done. So we have this gross picture of Caligula that is Caligula is I think one of the least, it's definitely the least known emperor of the Julio-Claudian dynasty from a historiographical point of view. It's the one we know the least about. But also in here, even the anecdote of the horse that is appointed senator, it's not that Caligula went nuts. I mean, as much as we know, yeah, he might be that he kind of got... You don't have to think that these were times in which people were so psychologically stable. I mean, today we have much better living conditions. These people also at the top of society are kind of were put under many pressures, so I'm not kind of denying in block the fact that Caligula might have been mentally disturbed or something like that. But even the episode of the horse doesn't mean that he was nuts and he simply appointed a horse senator. That was an extremely clever move instead, to mock the senators, to tell them, look, that if I want as an emperor, I can appoint even a horse senators, and that's how I keep you senators in regard. And so the Caligula had also been grown among certain at the court with certain descendants of the Egyptian dynasty who had this very monarchical ideals and grandeur, and so there are many ways to explain such a portrait of Caligula, and not definitely the fact it was I'm personally extremely and deeply disgusted by how many people look at sources and read them as if but in general, not even at sources, because these people don't even read sources, but I'm telling you the idea, oh, that emperor was disgusting, was a monster, was a tyrant. Yeah, this is typical of especially certain areas of the world that have to interpret history in a moralistic way. What the hell do you know what an emperor of the 1st century AD really was, given the sources we have? What the hell do you know? You know nothing. And if you read those sources, you can understand something that is much deeper, that even the negative propaganda about his figures has left us in a certain way, because this also forget to read any Roman source and thinking that those were free thinkers. It was nothing like free thinking at the time, historiographically speaking. Everybody wrote because they had an agenda, because they belonged to a milieu, because they were clients of someone else. So be aware of these things. And even Nero, that passes as a monster, as a depraved, was actually one of the best emperors of Rome. Nero did certain amazing things in his during his empire. Nero's economic reforms remained for fundamentally unaltered for up to Diocletian. It's under him that the Parthians were first crushed. Nero was an amazing emperor, and we will get into detail when we will talk about him now if I start a series on Rome. So everything has to be understood in the moment which these figures, having been educated by and grown by the senatorial conservatives, basically they turned their back to this senatorial aristocracy. They started doing something that was effectively good for the functioning of the empire, and these senators couldn't stand it, because it meant that their economical system was based on stagnation and protectionism, was open to the middle classes, and they hated this because those were more competitive than them. The golden coin was devaluated, so their acquiring power was lower. So this is the reason why you have these portraits, and this inner tension that always existed between the emperor and the Senate, and this is also what several civil wars were fought at one point. So probably the only great fault of the Augustean system had been the lack of a functional successory system, because the empire was not hereditary. The Romans had created this concept of princeps, not even the concept of an empire, stressing the old Indo-European ideal of equality. That the emperor is technically a leader, a military leader, that the other freemen follow, not because it's him as a human being, but because military glory derives from divine sanction. So they were following the Aryan military glory and not the man in himself, that theoretically, given the ancient Indo-Aryan tribalism, was equal to anyone else, and his glory was only due to the deity of the stars. Naturally, the emperors stressed now instead their kind of divine nature, especially after death, of course. Not their divine nature, because the Romans never quite thought that they were gods, but they were deified eventually after their death, and therefore during their lives they were, however, acting through the deity fundamentally. The deity was acting through them, sorry. So this was the general imperial thing. So we have no time to go deeper into this now, but it's a very important concept you have to always bear in mind when you consider even the internal balance of the empire. So I was saying that there was no succession, because that would have turned the Roman republican ideals into, that would have been unacceptable, especially in the West, because in the West, even Italy and the Italic background from which the Romans came, were kind of still strongly tribally, and this strong Indo-European political mindset for which everybody's equal. Not surprisingly, the Roman emperors made their greatest divine-like show-off in the eastern provinces. Augustus in Rome was just first among equals among all the Roman free citizens, while in Egypt he was a kind of a godlike figure. That's simply because in the East, those peoples had been used to the kings of to the pharaohs, to the kings of kings, to this great kind of deified, divine-like entities. And it was easier also in the political dialectics to act in that fashion in order to rule those countries. However, these mechanisms of successions were quite complicated, because the Senate also had its own say into the whole thing. Now also the Praetorian Guard, as we know, was rising in power. It was becoming a kind of there was a sort of deep state to the Roman Empire. Was checking what the emperors did, and this led, since actually the very first century AD, so actually a few decades after Augustus' death, to the first civil wars that partially also kind of weakened the empire, definitely. So just to conclude, another character of the Roman Empire at this point, as we were saying, was the multi-ethnical and pluricultural one. This was typical of the empire. It was nothing really strange in the ancient world regarding to this. This probably derives from the nature of the empires themselves that we described before. Essentially this military occupation. The whole world was conceived in religious fashion. I repeat, just like before, that whoever thinks that the Roman Empire was a sort of lay or secular empire doesn't know much about the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was deeply religious, and the same concept of the empire was exclusively religiously meant. The empire was a divine gift of the sky divinity, of Jupiter. This is proper of all Indo-European populations. That's how the Romans thought, and there was no other way to legitimize this human rule of the empire. And at this point, this was a polytheistic world, which means you can take everybody's deity and it's fine. And that's how a polytheist reasons. Same as I often say, the concept of polytheism is typically monotheistic, because it's only if you're monotheistic that you pose yourself the problem of being a polytheist. When you are a polytheist, you really think there are so many gods everywhere, and all you have to do is to engrace them to you if you want to make something. So it was perfectly normal that there were also many rights among the Romans to actually adopt. Was a formula, right? The devotion as well, to include deities into the under the Roman protection. It's very important because it was felt that the empire was expanding by sanction of the greatest deity of the skies, and that all the other smaller deities could follow in this. In fact, the Romans usually, before conquering a city, they made this kind of call to the local deity by saying, if you let us win now, because we will win anyway. This was the Roman mindset. We will honor you as a deity, and we will treat you even better than the people who worship you in here. But if you don't, because we will conquer this city, because we have the greatest god from our side, the one of the sky, Jupiter, Tonans, we will destroy you and we will erase your memory from the face of the earth. So this is the brutal and terrible Roman mindset. It is beautiful as well, and it was normal also to other polytheistic peoples actually. But it's important because it entailed, in fact, all this kind of adoption of all these other deities. And this system had kind of worked, especially up to the moment in which, in fact, the empire had expanded. So you have to think that in ancient times there weren't many other views of the world but the idea that you somewhat had to conquer it. I mean, the military ethos was very, very much out there as a finalistic thing. Every kind of empire wanted to conquer, to win, to have glory, even if they didn't have universalistic ambitions. However, deep inside they thought that they had to be undefeated. Roma invicta, for instance. And that was normal. But obviously Rome had a much greater ambition than, a small Celtic tribe from Britain, as you can imagine. But still, they shared this idea, and in fact, the common celestial deity of the sky was out there always for every Indo-European people, and beyond even, because this is something you find also in non-Indo-Europeans in part. So, as long as the empire had expanded, this system had eventually worked. I mean, the Romans, aside from certain minor setbacks, had managed to conquer the world, the known world, and that's how they saw it rightfully, and they were right from their perspectives. As we have seen, they didn't know much else of the rest of the world, so they really felt to have conquered it all. The problem starts when this expansion ceases, where barbarians start pushing and even entering into from the frontiers. And at that point there was a great probably this is very overlooked. I never read anything about it, but there was a pretty hard moral shock. I mean, if you're used to believe that you are the elected people on earth, according to the Sibylline books, this was a secret of Rome. The idea that, however, Rome had this mission of being the leader of the world. Point. No more nor less. So the unique empire of the world. When you start being on the defensive, there are barbarians that invade you, that raid you, will cause problems. You can't even react effectively all the time. I mean, the Romans reacted pretty effectively most of the times, but they were still under pressure. Where's the glory? Where's the eagle of the empire? So that was probably an enormous moral shock, an enormous psychological shock. If these guys had truly believed for centuries that they were the chosen people because they had won literally everyone on earth and conquered them, what was happening now? Where was the celestial deity? Now the celestial deity remained, but it's the way to reach it that changed path, because evidently there was something that had went astray during along the way. Naturally, the more traditionalist components of Roman society still believed that there was some reason for which the celestial deity had been angered by and therefore had taken away the glory. For instance, the persecution of Christianity and other cults that were considered as illicit stemmed exactly from this reason. I mean, the Romans were also, this idea of Roman tolerance is relative. I mean, tolerance really didn't exist at the time as we imagine it today. The Romans were tolerant as in the sense that they, as we've seen, they accepted every kind of cult as long as the worshippers also pledged, fealty to the Roman imperial deity. So, as you know, the Christians refused to do that, for example, and the real problem there, in fact, was not that it was conceived just like an offense, like, oh, these Christians don't like us Romans, we know, what do we have to do? The Romans were truly concerned that this attitude would bring the divine wrath on them, because the idea was that it was the whole community that had to be disciplined towards the deity and faithful towards it. So even if one person did something wrong, the whole society was to pay for it. And that's why they were so actually, even towards the Christians, of course there were persecutions, people were slaughtered, etc., but most of the times we know also from the juridical practices that also they didn't slaughter Christians as soon as one said, I don't want to burn the frankincense on the altar. No, they were called several times. Why don't you want to make this sacrifice? Are you sure? Look, that we will kill you if you don't do it. Then we're called again. We know it. So it was relatively tolerant and civil also in that fashion, but it was not tolerant in the sense that every kind of cult that was that excluded the possibility of pledging fealty to the imperial deity was irreconcilable with the Roman system for this very reason. So because of these problems that we have seen, the barbarian invasions, the epidemics, the poverty, etc., there was a new moral sensibility developing, a new different feelings, and in this idea that people wanted to be saved in a certain sense, because this was a very material world. I mean, even the Christian concept of salvation that was embraced so eagerly by these masses of disinherited, of marginalized, it wasn't initially really thought in the true Christian way. It took centuries, and if not millennia, before Europeans arguably learned what is that Christianity really means at a theological level. These people all wanted to be saved, because polytheism, which this world was all about, was really about contractualism. Let's say, what do I have to do contractually to make this deity favoring me and therefore making me feel good as a living person? There wasn't such a positive opinion of the afterlife at the time. The Roman afterlife was actually a gloomy place. Was not a beautiful place to stay. So the idea is that in life you had to enjoy, even physically, materially. There was this idea. Naturally, the ancient philosophies was quite diversified. It was even the idea of an Elysium, a sort of paradise. So also this changed throughout Roman history. There were several currents, now also other philosophies coming from the East, about Stoicism, Epicureanism, etc., but so many other cults as well. that during these times were pushing practically towards the need for salvation in order to cope with this ever-growing spiritual fear, this spiritual inquiet, I don't know how to say it, this inquietude fundamentally. And so these ancient cults were inspired to a cosmic conception of a natural order with the cycle of seasons, of the agrarian life, and local traditions and cults, etc. were not satisfying anymore. They didn't appear as satisfying anymore. People wanted more. They wanted to have a greater safety. They wanted to feel protected in this world that seemed as if was kind of tearing itself apart. So, throughout the Hellenization of Roman society, there had been certain mysteric cults of Eastern origin that had been introduced fundamentally, and this came from several areas. There were even certain Hellenic cults, but they mostly came from Egypt, from Syria, Babylon, or Phrygia, or Persia as well. Some of these came also from far away. For instance, Mithras, if I'm not, I don't know how you say it in English. Wait, was, however, we won't talk about him again. He was a deity that was mediated in Persia from the ancient Vedic religion in India. It was one of the Auxiliaries, actually. So a lot of syncretism, as you can imagine, towards which polytheism was quite open by definition. So all of these cults came to Rome pretty soon. There were the temple to Isis. I think was pretty ancient in Rome. So it existed already at times of Caesar or Augustus, for certain. I don't remember. Others came from. They were mostly also great. They were pretty diverse cults actually, but they were also diversified according to certain ideas. For instance, the cult of Mithras was very important, very famous, but it seemingly didn't spread so deeply into Roman society because it was mostly a kind of a military cult in many ways. So there were certain other beliefs also related to this female figures, female deities related to the natural cycle of seasons. Typical female deities of fertility that were already present naturally both in the Greek and the Roman religion, but that were more famous in the East because those were more agrarian societies. Even the Greeks and the Romans is more Indo-European. They were more leaning from the male war deities than else. But this idea of the mother, of the great mother, that is positive from a physical point of view for well-being, etc., was also pretty fashionable at the time. But at the same time, there is the development also of other figures in an enotheistic sense, that is fundamentally there are certain they have a sort of transcendental nature. So they approach monotheism fundamentally because they accept the idea they're polytheistic because they have still so many deities all around, but these deities are either manifestations of the greater deity, or they are however subordinated to it, and these were usually solar religions. And in fact, even when you look at the religion of Julianus that tried to restore paganism in the 4th century, you realize that wasn't at all the Roman religion. Many people don't even know what the Roman religion is, and indeed we do know very few about what it is. Many people confuse the Roman religion with practically the copy of the Greek pantheon, and this never actually happened. Roman religion was something extremely archaic that already by the 1st century BC the Romans didn't quite understand themselves. It was typically, it was still kind of almost animistic. It was so primitive. The Romans had an enormous, incredibly fast development in terms of civilization in very few centuries. So even this religion didn't have the time to catch up with the expansion of Rome. So they had this extremely archaic and primitive religion back of the Italic world, and that was the true Roman religion. And when you look at Julianus and you say, oh, the old gods, this guy wanted to restore, those weren't the old Roman gods. That was a sort of a Hellenistic religion, pretty, pretty Eastern in fashion, very different from the essentials of the ancient Roman religion in many ways, at least in its forms. I'm sure Julianus was also very kind of, he knew much about also the ancient Roman religion, but it was still something extremely different. Caesar would have been shocked to have seen a religion like that, if you think of being Roman, practically. So, however, this universalistic religions that have an ever greater spiritual nature, these soteric cults, fundamentally, from the Greek soter, which means savior, we're insisting on the transcendental nature of deity, and also on the survival of the soul after death. So there was this kind of increased detachment from of material life from spiritual life. The idea also of a reward after that for the sufferance in life is something that the Christians didn't invent at all. This was something that existed in all kind of many Hellenistic religions. Judaism was influenced by them as well. So this all came from a very homogeneous, syncretic background that was being developed according to the new spiritual tensions of the time. And naturally, the ultimate redemption entailed the eternal salvation, and this was also pretty much out there even before Christianity. So these cults increased they had a greater success the more this kind of barbaric threats, internal insecurity, and spiritual inquietude grew towards the end of the 2nd century AD. So, okay, this is more or less what I wanted to talk to you about today. I hope everything is clear. I know I've dealt with these topics. I've addressed these topics in a very concise way. I couldn't do better because I've touched many of them that are difficult to reconcile easily even in some hours of talking. But for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.